The courtroom fell silent. Even the clerk stopped writing. What Jasmine Crockett said next made Justice Breyer lean forward in stunned respect. For a heartbeat, no one dared to breathe. The fluorescent lights hummed above. The microphones buzzed. Faintly, but every eye in the chamber was fixed on the woman who had just defied expectation. Moments earlier, the room had been anything but calm. Sharp interruptions, smug smiles, and the dismissive tone of seasoned voices had filled the air. Crockett, seated with the kind of poise that only comes from quiet confidence, had endured it all. She knew the game: belittle the young, underestimate the woman, dismiss the outsider. The so-called experts leaned on arrogance like a crutch, convinced that their titles and years alone could silence brilliance. But Crockett's words sliced through the noise like a blade. She spoke not with fury, but with precision, measured, deliberate, undeniable. Her cadence carried the weight of lived struggle and legal mastery, and the courtroom, once restless, transformed into an audience hanging on her every syllable. Even those who had moments earlier rolled their eyes now found themselves leaning in, afraid to miss a single line. And then it happened. Justice Stephen Breyer, long regarded as one of the most thoughtful voices on the bench, adjusted his glasses, leaned forward ever so slightly, listened with a focus that told everyone present something extraordinary was unfolding. Respect is never given freely in rooms like these. It is earned in real time, under the brightest lights and sharpest scrutiny. Crockett had just crossed that threshold. For those in the audience, it was a moment impossible to ignore. Phones buzzed quietly as observers sent hurried messages. "You won't believe what just happened." Journalists shifted in their seats, scribbling frantically, aware they were witnessing the kind of exchange that could ripple far beyond these walls. But what made this moment truly explosive wasn't just the silence, or Breyer's reaction, or even the collective gasp of realization. It was the sense, raw, undeniable, that the balance of power in the room had just shifted. For the first time, the so-called underdog was no longer playing defense. She was setting the terms, and as eyes darted between Crockett and Breyer, no one could have guessed just how far her words would travel, or how deeply they would change the conversation that followed, raise the stakes, the silence that followed. Her words wasn't just silence, it was tension stretched thin, like a wire about to snap. This was no ordinary courtroom exchange. Behind the polished wood and marble, an ideological battle was being fought, one that touched the very foundation of democracy itself. The case at hand was technical on paper, another dispute over policy and precedent. But in reality, it was a proxy war over truth versus manipulation, over whether the system could still stand firm against arrogance and deception. Inside these walls, decisions weren't just rulings, they were signals to the nation. A single exchange could tilt public trust, ignite political movements, or cast doubt on institutions already under siege. The chamber's atmosphere reflected that weight. Opponents of Jasmine Crockett, armed with decades of insider privilege, viewed her as a convenient target. To them, she was inexperienced, emotional, a young voice meant to be overshadowed by the gravitas of their resumes. They came ready to dominate, to swat away her contributions like a nuisance. And for the first half hour, they tried. They interrupted, mocked her tone, and chuckled at her questions. The cameras caught the smirks, the whispers shared between senior figures who thought the outcome was predetermined. They had played this game for years, cornering newcomers and drowning them in condescension. What they didn't see was Crockett's quiet strategy unfolding beneath their arrogance. Each interruption she absorbed only sharpened her resolve. Every dismissive glance fueled her preparation. She had studied not just the case, but the behavior of those who believed her too small to matter. To them, she was an afterthought. To her, they were a script she had already memorized. Justice Breyer's presence added another layer of gravity. Though retired, his words still echoed through the legal community, and his respect carried symbolic power. The villains in the room expected Breyer to side instinctively with the familiar, the seasoned, the established, the self-proclaimed keepers of tradition. That assumption, unspoken yet palpable, emboldened their arrogance. After all, why would a towering figure of The court wastes his time giving weight to a rising legislator like Jasmine Crockett. But moments like these weren't just about argumentation. They were about who owned the narrative of justice in America. Would the future belong to the gatekeepers who clung to power by dismissing others, or to the new voices who demanded that truth be heard without apology? Every second in that chamber was proof that this wasn't only a case. It was a stage where history itself was rehearsing its next act. Outside the courtroom, the stakes were just as high. Across the country, millions were already skeptical of institutions, weary of leaders who preached fairness while practicing elitism. The people wanted authenticity, and Crockett carried that with her like armor. She didn't need to posture. Her life had been preparation enough. Still, her opponents couldn't see it. They saw only what they wanted to see: a newcomer, overconfident, and bound to falter. Their mistake was underestimating her resolve. Her composure wasn't passivity, it was calculation. Her silence in the face of mockery wasn't weakness, it was patience. And when the moment came for her to reveal just how sharp her blade had been honed, would not only silence a courtroom, but echo across headlines, social media feeds, and living rooms far beyond those walls. Asterisk, they thought they were watching a rookie stumble into a storm. But what they didn't know was that Jasmine Crockett had already weathered storms far greater than this. Every doubt cast her way was fuel, every smirk a challenge she welcomed. But they had no idea how prepared she truly was. Antagonist backstory: they entered the chamber as though it already belonged to them. Polished suits, well-rehearsed smirks, the practiced cadence of people who had spent decades treating the courtroom like their personal stage. These were the antagonists of the story, entrenched voices of power who had built their reputations, not on fairness, but on dominance. To them, law was not a shield for justice. It was a weapon to protect their own status. They had a long history of belittling those who threatened the comfort of their control. Progressive voices, particularly younger women and legislators of color, were easy prey in their eyes. Time after time, they had dismissed such figures as naive or unqualified, often more interested in spectacle than substance. Their strategy was consistent: ridicule, overwhelm, and outlast. They relied on condescension as a tool of survival. For years it had worked. In hearings, they had perfected the art of the sigh, the headshake, the well-timed chuckle that turned substantive debate into mockery. They leaned heavily on procedural jargon, cloaking arrogance in the language of tradition. And if tradition itself failed to silence challengers, they invoked their seniority, as though years alone were proof of righteousness. The record showed their pattern clearly. Rising legislators who dared to speak boldly often found themselves the target of orchestrated takedowns. Clips would circulate, carefully edited to frame these newcomers as reckless or uninformed. While the establishment figures basked in the image of order and authority, their followers celebrated these moments as victories, proof that the old guard still held the reins of legitimacy. But arrogance is a fragile armor. Behind the polished exteriors was a quiet desperation, an awareness that their grip on power was slipping. They watched as younger generations demanded accountability, as movements swelled across social media, as new leaders spoke directly to the people instead of bowing to old institutions. The antagonists clung tighter to their roles, doubling down on the very dismissiveness that now threatened to expose them. And so, when Jasmine Crockett entered the courtroom, they saw not a colleague or a peer, but an opportunity. Here was another chance to prove their superiority, to remind the audience, both in the chamber and beyond, that they still controlled the narrative. They underestimated her instantly, reading her composure as inexperience, mistaking her measured tone for hesitation. Their arrogance told them she was another easy target. The exchanges began predictably. They interrupted, confident their interruptions alone would rattle her. They rolled their eyes, confident the cameras would capture their disdain and broadcast it as authority. One leaned back in his chair with a smirk that said, "We've done this before, and we'll do it again." Their very body language screamed dismissal, but what they failed to see was the quiet brilliance and the contrast unfolding before them. Their arrogance was loud, theatrical, and desperate for validation. Her brilliance was silent, steady, and anchored in substance. While they relied on tricks of tone, she relied on the strength of her preparation. While they sought to create noise, she focused on clarity. The gulf between them was widening with every word exchanged, though they remained blind to it. The tension for the audience was clear. Arrogance was about to meet its reckoning. And the more the antagonist sneered, the more viewers watching, both in the room and later through countless screens, began to shift their sympathies. Villains were overplaying their hand. Instead of projecting control, they revealed insecurity. Instead of silencing a younger voice, they amplified her presence by showing the lengths they would go to deny it. The irony was palpable. They had spent years crafting the image of untouchable authority. Yet in their treatment of Crockett, they displayed exactly why their reign was crumbling. Their laughter no longer sounded like confidence. It sounded like fear disguised as bravado. Their interruptions no longer resembled mastery. They resembled desperation to hold on to a stage that no longer belonged solely to them. Justice. Breyer's quiet attention added another layer of humiliation they didn't yet realize. While they believed their antics were winning the moment, Breyer's body language suggested otherwise. He was no longer watching them. His respect, his focus, his interest, all of it was drifting toward the very woman they sought to belittle. In trying to crush her, it had unintentionally illuminated her. And this is the fatal flaw of arrogance. It blinds its bearer to reality until the collapse becomes inevitable. Every sneer, every interruption, every performative dismissal brought them closer to that collapse. The audience could feel it building, the tension mounting like the rising swell of a symphony before its thunderous release. For Crockett, the stage they thought they owned was becoming hers with every passing second. The more they displayed their contempt, the more the contrast sharpened between their arrogance and her calm brilliance. They believed they were writing her downfall, but in truth, they were authoring their own. What none of them realized was that the very tactics they had wielded for decades would soon become the backdrop for their most humiliating defeat. And when it came, it wouldn't be loud or theatrical. It would be quiet, devastating, and undeniable. Because Jasmine Crockett wasn't just surviving their contempt. She was waiting. And her moment was coming. Protagonist backstory, long before she froze a courtroom with the force of her words. Jasmine Crockett was fighting battles in places that rarely make headlines. Her journey did not begin in the comfort of legacy or the ease of privilege. It began in the grit of service, in the constant demand to prove herself in spaces that were never built to welcome her. Crockett's story is not one of entitlement. It is one of persistence. Raised in a world where respect was not handed out freely, she learned early that the only way forward was through relentless work and unapologetic truth. The courtroom may have been the scene of her triumph, but her path wound through late nights at law school, endless hours poring over case law, and the constant balancing act of service and survival. She did not stumble into brilliance. Carved it out of resistance. As an attorney, Crockett chose the cases others avoided. She stood with the marginalized, defended those most easily dismissed, and gave voice to people who had been told their voices didn't matter. In Texas, she built a reputation as a fighter who would not back down, even when the odds were stacked against her. Too many, she became more than a lawyer. She became a shield, a voice, a reminder that justice did not belong only to the privileged few. Her sharpness was never confined to the courtroom. In political life, she faced the same dismissals that would later echo in that chamber: the patronizing tones, the questions about her qualifications, the smirks of rivals who assumed she was punching above her weight. But with every condescending glance, she pushed harder, defied expectations, and expanded her influence. Each challenge became fuel. Each setback became preparation. Personal sacrifice was part of the cost. Public service meant nights away from family, endless scrutiny, and the heavy burden of carrying not just her own ambition, but the hopes of those who saw in her someone willing to fight for them. The pressure was immense, yet it only strengthened her resolve. Where others buckled under the weight of doubt, Crockett found clarity. The bigger the fight, the sharper her focus. Moments of defiance defined her career. She stood her ground against policies designed to silence communities of color. She refused to let intimidation tactics dictate her work. She faced attacks, sometimes blatant, sometimes veiled, and countered them with facts, with fire, and with a calm that unnerved her adversaries. To dismiss her was to misunderstand her entirely. Behind every calm expression was a lifetime of battles fought, and won in rooms that felt just as hostile, if not more so, than the one she now occupied. What set Crockett apart was not just her intellect, though it was formidable, but her authenticity. She never tried to mimic the cadence of establishment figures, never tried to blend into the traditions that had so often been weaponized to keep people like her on the margins. She spoke plainly, passionately, with the clarity of someone who knew her words carried the weight of lived experience. That authenticity resonated because it was real. For audiences watching her rise, it was impossible not to feel connected. She wasn't polished in the way the old guard demanded. Day was polished in the way reality demanded. Every case she had taken, every insult she had endured, every sacrifice she had made was etched into the way she carried herself. To supporters, she was proof that brilliance didn't require permission. To opponents, she was a reminder that their strategies of dismissal were no longer enough. And so when she entered that courtroom, underestimated and dismissed as usual, she carried all of that history with her. She carried the weight of the clients she had defended, the policies she had fought, the sleepless nights of preparation, the sting of every past insult. To her opponents, she appeared composed and restrained. But to those who knew her journey, that composure was the mask of a warrior who had been sharpening her blade for years. Every battle had prepared her for this. Every slight had steeled her. Every sacrifice had built the foundation she now stood on. So when her words cut through the arrogance of the room and commanded the respect of Justice Breyer himself, it was not a fluke. It was destiny converging. With preparation for the audience, admiration flowed naturally. They saw not just a single moment of brilliance, but the culmination of a life lived in pursuit of truth. They saw someone who carried dignity into hostile spaces and turned condescension into fuel. They saw the living embodiment of resilience. And in that instant, the courtroom was no longer just about the case at hand. It was about the story of Jasmine Crockett, a story of defiance, sacrifice, and brilliance that could no longer be ignored. And as she stood calmly, her opponents, still failing to understand the gravity of what was unfolding, the audience knew this was more than a debate. This was history in motion. And the most dramatic moment had yet to come. The tension in the chamber thickened with each passing second. By now, the opening pleasantries were long forgotten. The courtroom had transformed into a battlefield, not one of swords and shields, but of words sharp enough to cut reputations in half. The villains of this narrative, those entrenched voices of arrogance, leaned in with smug confidence. They had sparred in countless debates before. Their playbook rarely failed. Dismiss, interrupt, overwhelm. One of them started with a cutting remark disguised as a legal question. Perhaps, counsel, you misunderstand the constitutional intent. Here, the antagonist said with a half-smirk, projecting superiority not only to Jasmine Crockett, but to anyone who dared challenge his grasp of history. His words echoed like a gavel of arrogance, daring anyone to contradict him. The courtroom watched closely. Would Crockett stumble? Would she yield ground the way so many younger voices had been pushed aside before? But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Instead, she adjusted her glasses, took a breath, and spoke with measured calm. Her voice, though not raised, carried the weight of certainty. On the contrary, it is precisely because I understand the intent that I refuse to let it be twisted into something it was never meant to serve. The antagonist leaned back, momentarily thrown off. His expression said it all. He hadn't expected composure, let alone a rebuttal sharp enough to pierce through his condescension. What followed was a duel of rhythm. He interrupted her once, then twice, each time attempting to cut her momentum short. Each time, Crockett paused politely, allowed him just enough rope. then took back control with clarity that made the interruptions look petty. She was steady, surgical, turning every attempt to silence her into evidence of her opponent's desperation. A hush fell when another antagonist chimed in. It's more aggressive this time. "You speak of justice," he scoffed, "but your interpretation relies on bending precedent beyond recognition." Crockett's reply landed like a thunderclap. Precedent was never meant to be a prison. Justice is not a fossil to be admired. In a museum, it's a living principle. When precedent is weaponized to deny it, the courts must correct course. Even Justice Breyer's eyebrows lifted at that. The room froze for just a beat too long, the kind of silence that signaled a turning tide. Still, the antagonists pressed on. Their interruptions became more frantic, their tone harsher, as though volume could replace substance. But Crockett didn't take the bait. Her posture remained unshaken, her tone steady. She countered point for point, fact for fact, never allowing emotion to cloud the precision of her argument. It was as though she had anticipated each challenge long before it arrived. Observers in the gallery began to lean in, captivated. The subtle shift was undeniable. Arrogance was beginning to look like desperation, while composure was starting to look like victory. And then came the turning point. One antagonist, visibly agitated, attempted a sweeping dismissal. This entire line of reasoning is nothing more than political theater, and frankly, beneath the seriousness of this court. The jab was bold, but also reckless. Crockett did not hesitate. Defending the Constitution and protecting the people it was written for is considered theater. She said, her voice cutting with conviction, then perhaps it is this court that needs to remember who the audience truly is, the American people. The room went silent again. Not even the clerks shuffled papers this time. Justice Breyer leaned forward, his expression unreadable but unmistakably attentive. The antagonists shifted uncomfortably, the weight of her words landing heavier than any legal citation could. This was no longer a simple debate. This was Crockett seizing the moment she had prepared for all her life, turning interruptions into spotlights and dismissals into opportunities. And as the air hung thick with anticipation, it became clear to everyone present the tide had turned. And then the turning point arrived. The room was already electric, the air humming with the tension of clashing ideals and simmering egos. For over an hour, the exchanges had escalated like a slow-burning fire-snide remarks from the opposition. Smug interruptions that tried to reduce Jasmine Crockett's voice to background noise, and a courtroom gallery that felt like an audience trapped between disbelief and anticipation. Then, without raising her voice, Crockett struck. It began with a question, not to the judge, not to the opposing counsel, but to the very premise of their argument. She leaned forward, eyes locked on her opponent, and said, "If justice means protecting power instead of protecting people, then tell me whose justice are you really defending?" The words did not shout. They didn't need to. They cut. Every syllable hung in the air like shards of glass, forcing everyone in the chamber to take a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. For a split second, silence reigned. Pens froze mid-sentence. One clerk's jaw slackened. The opponent caught flat-footed, blinked rapidly as if searching for a script that wasn't there. And that was the turning point, the moment when a single line pierced through the fog of arrogance and revealed the hollowness of their stance. The gasps that started in the gallery. A soft murmur rippled through the benches, the kind of sound that meant people weren't just hearing the words, they were feeling them. A few gasps escaped, sharp and unguarded, betraying the shock of witnessing something greater than a legal argument. And then came the silence. A silence so complete, it felt orchestral. The hum of the air vents, the shuffling of paper, the rustle of robes, all of it seemed to fade into a void that revolved solely around Crockett's words. The villain rattled the opposition had entered. The room certain of dominance. They had relied on decades of precedent, on the weight of titles, on the casual dismissal of a younger, sharper, progressive voice. But now their composure cracked. The lead antagonist coughed, shuffled papers, and attempted a rebuttal. You misunderstand the principle of, but his voice faltered. His usual rhythm, the polished cadence honed through years of lectures and debates, broke down into fragments. He looked less like a master of law and more like a man suddenly aware that he was standing on a stage with the spotlight burning through his carefully crafted disguise. Every attempt to regain footing stumbled. The harder he tried to reassert control, the clearer it became. Crockett had seized the narrative. Justice Breyer's reaction, and then it happened. Justice Stephen Breyer, who had been leaning back, listening with the trained patience of a lifetime on the bench, shifted forward. Slowly, deliberately, he rested his chin on one hand, studying Crockett with an intensity that radiated across the chamber. His eyes narrowed. Not in skepticism, but in focus. Then came the nod, small, almost imperceptible dip of the head. But packed with the gravity of recognition, this was no ordinary acknowledgement. This was a seasoned jurist, a man who had heard every kind of argument imaginable. Silently confessing, "You've impressed me." The nod froze the room. The clerk stopped, pretending to take notes. The gallery stared. Even Crockett's opponents registered it, their confidence draining as the unspoken verdict spread through the air like wildfire. Jasmine Crockett had not only held her own, she had won something deeper. She had earned respect, a courtroom transformed. From that moment, the energy shifted. No longer was Crockett the underestimated participant fighting uphill against towering egos. She was the axis of the courtroom, the gravitational center pulling every gaze, every breath, every ounce of attention toward her. Her opponent, red-faced and flustered, tried once more to counter. But the attempt came off brittle, defensive, almost desperate. Every line he spoke felt reactive, secondary, small. Crockett, by contrast, didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her calm composure made her victory even sharper. She adjusted her papers, waited politely, and when given the chance, expanded her argument with surgical precision. Each word reinforced the blow she had already dealt. The audience electrified the gallery, packed with journalists, legal scholars, and curious citizens, sensed the history of the moment. Pens scribbled furiously across notepads. Phones buzzed. In silent mode as observers typed frantic notes to editors, one reporter mouthed to another, "Did you see Breyer's face?" Everyone knew this wasn't just about a case. It was about power, about the underestimated finally claiming their rightful stage, about watching someone transform from promising to undeniable in real time and in the whispers after. As the session concluded, refrains spread like a chant. Crockett owned that room. Maximum payoff. The climax reached its full force when the presiding clerk attempted to move the proceedings forward. But even then, for a heartbeat too long, the courtroom did not move. It was as though time itself had stalled, caught between the echo of Crockett's words and Breyer's silent nod of respect. Every individual present knew they had witnessed something reran unstageable, unrepeatable collision of preparation, courage, and brilliance. For Crockett, it was more than just winning an argument. It was the culmination of years of battles, the payoff of sacrifice, the vindication of carrying her principles like armor into every fight for her opponents. It was humiliation without theatrics, the kind that stings precisely because it is delivered with grace. And for Justice Breyer, it was a reminder that the law is not just about precedents and protocols. It is about people who dare to breathe life into those words, who command respect not by demanding it, but by embodying it. The legacy of the moment later, observers would struggle to describe the scene. Some called it a mic drop. Others said it was less like a drop and more like a lightning strike sudden, undeniable, impossible to ignore. But for those who were there, the memory was crystal clear, the silence after her words, the visible faltering of the opposition, and Justice Breyer's quiet, unmistakable nod and acknowledgement that froze the courtroom and etched Crockett's brilliance into history. It wasn't just a line in a debate. It was a shift in narrative. It was proof that brilliance, when coupled with courage, doesn't just speak, it commands. And in that chamber, On that day, Jasmine Crockett commanded everything. The moment Justice Breyer's, subtle but unmistakable, nod of respect rippled across the courtroom, a shift began, one that no amount of partisan spin could immediately contain. Silence had barely dissolved when the reactions began, its first whispered gasps. Then, the flood of tapping fingers on glowing phone screens as reporters and aides scrambled to capture what had just unfolded. In minutes, fragments of Crockett's argument and Breyer's visible acknowledgement were racing across social media like wildfire. #Crockett frozen, the court trended first, quickly joined by #Breyer nods and #respect earned. The hashtags weren't just words. They were banners, rallying cries for those who felt they had just witnessed something historic. Clips of the exchange looped endlessly, her calm delivery, his measured pause, the stunned expression on the antagonist's face. The footage became the new political currency of the day. Pundits who had dismissed her as too green, too fiery, or too partisan found themselves cornered by reality. On cable panels that night, even her fiercest critics conceded grudgingly that she had delivered a masterclass in composure, logic, and timing. What you will about her politics, one veteran commentator admitted, but in that room at that moment, she owned it, and Justice Breyer knew it. The impact wasn't just about optics. Her performance reverberated because of who had recognized her. Justice Breyer, known for his meticulous reasoning and aversion to theatrics, wasn't prone to visible endorsements. A raised eyebrow, a quiet nod, a frozen pause from him carried more weight than a dozen fiery speeches. It was the kind of subtle acknowledgement that insiders knew meant everything. It wasn't applause, but it was validation, and validation at that level was an SPI enable. In activist circles, Crockett's brilliance became a rallying point. "This is what fighting back with brains looks like," one grassroots leader tweeted, sharing the clip with millions. For young lawyers, students, and progressive organizers, she became proof that expertise and fearlessness could still puncture arrogance in the highest chambers of power. Law schools circulated the footage as a case study in rhetorical precision. In classrooms, professors paused lectures to replay the moment, dissecting her phrasing, her pacing. The strategic calm that dismantled bluster without ever raising her voice. Meanwhile, her opponents scrambled. The villain, once untouchable in their pompous certainty, now appeared rattled in every subsequent appearance. No spin doctor could erase the image of their faltering words against Crockett's unwavering clarity. Editorials began to surface, not praising her politics, but acknowledging her command. "Underestimated until the moment it mattered most," one headline read. "Crockett shows what preparedness looks like." Even international outlets picked it up. In Europe and beyond, commentators drew parallels to other moments where underestimated voices had appended power dynamics. Crockett's courtroom exchange was framed not just as a legal skirmish, but as part of a larger story. The fight over truth in an age of manipulation. The clash between arrogance and earned brilliance. For Crockett, the night was surreal. Back in her office, the notifications pinged endlessly, colleagues, mentors, complete strangers flooding her inbox with admiration. Yet, beneath the euphoria, she remained grounded. She knew the fight wasn't won with one line, no matter how devastating. It wasn't the end of anything. If anything, it was a doorway, one she had fought her whole life to open. And Breyer's nod. That became something larger than itself. In a culture starved for authenticity, the sight of an elder, statesman of the court visibly respecting a younger, underestimated woman of color, carried weight that transcended politics. It was a passing of acknowledgement across generations, a recognition that intellect and preparation, not pedigree, not arrogance, had frozen the room. But as the headlines spread and the hashtags continued to climb, one truth became clear. The story wasn't closing. If anything, it was gathering force. Supporters whispered about what battles she might tackle next. Critics recalibrated, realizing they could no longer dismiss her so easily. And somewhere in the quiet of the night, Crockett herself prepared, knowing this moment was only fuel for the storms ahead, because this wasn't the end, was just the beginning. When the echoes of that decisive moment finally began to fade, something larger lingered in the air. It was more than a courtroom victory. It's more than a dazzling argument. What Jasmine Crockett had embodied that day was a truth as old as justice itself. Brilliance cannot be dismissed, and dignity, when held with unshakable resolve, will always triumph over arrogance. The villain's sneers, the interruptions, condescension, those belong to a long legacy of voices convinced that power alone defines authority. But Crockett reminded everyone that authority is not seized through volume or tradition. It is earned through clarity, courage, and substance. Her poise was proof that even in the most unequal of arenas, respect can shift like a tide when truth takes the floor. Justice. Breyer's nod was not simply a gesture of respect toward one lawyer in one heated debate. It was a generational acknowledgement. His career, marked by decades of jurisprudence, had taught him to recognize when history was whispering through a single person's words. By affirming Crockett's brilliance, he symbolically bridged two worlds: the established guardians of the law and the rising voices reshaping its future. And that is where the moral lies. It is not just about one woman proving herself against one rival. It is about the recognition that wisdom and truth transcend politics, age, gender, and even ideology. Greatness is never confined to those who came before, nor should it be hoarded by those in power. It flourishes wherever courage, preparation, and passion meet. Crockett stood there as living proof that when you stay rooted in your convictions, the universe often sends an unlikely alice sometimes, in the form of an elder statesman who simply knows brilliance when he sees it. For the audience who watched, the lesson was unavoidable. How often do we, too, dismiss the voices of the younger, the newer, the unproven? How often do we equate gray hair with wisdom and youth with naivety, forgetting that progress demands both? Crockett's victory was not only her own, but a reminder that truth doesn't carry an expiration date. It can arrive from a seasoned justice and a robour from a rising voice who refuses to be silenced. The moral crescendo comes here. When arrogance meets dignity, arrogance stumbles. It may bluster, it may interrupt, it may even dominate the stage for a time. But in the long run, dignity anchored in truth holds the stronger hand. That day, Crockett did not just win an argument. She revealed the futility of underestimating those who prepare relentlessly, who stand in service of something greater than themselves, refuse to cower when the moment demands courage. This is why the story struck such a universal chord. Beyond politics, beyond law, beyond the players in that courtroom, it was about something every viewer could feel: the desire to be seen, to be respected, to have one's voice acknowledged as valid. When Justice Breyer gave his subtle recognition, it wasn't just Crockett who felt uplifted. It was every person who had ever been dismissed, every individual told they were too new, too inexperienced, or out of their league. And so, the resolution was not the silence of a frozen courtroom, but the roar of something far larger, the roar of possibility. Crockett reminded us that battles are not won only on paper or in precedent, but in the human spirit. Breyer reminded us that wisdom is not weakened by recognizing new brilliance. It is strengthened by it. Together, their exchange became more than a fleeting headline. It became a parable, the moral lesson. America is at its best when it remembers that justice is not static. It grows, it adapts, it listens. And in listening, it affirms the timeless truth. Respect is the cornerstone of dignity. Dignity is the bedrock of justice. In that courtroom, arrogance cracked and respect rose. Crockett represented resilience. Breyer embodied the humility of wisdom. And together, they gave us all a glimpse of what Americanness, at its very core, truly means: a place where brilliance cannot be buried, where voices cannot be silenced forever, and where dignity, no matter how underestimated, will always rise to meet the moment. And so we return to the moment that started it, all the flash of brilliance that froze a courtroom. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument, she carved her name into history. Justice Stephen Breyer's subtle nod wasn't just respect, it was recognition that truth, when spoken with clarity and courage, has the power to silence arrogance and command reverence. This wasn't about politics, sides, or factions. It was about dignity rising above dismissiveness. It was about brilliance refusing to be overshadowed. It was about a woman who carried her battles, scars, and sacrifices into that room and proved, without question, that her voice carried the weight of justice itself. The lesson is clear. Arrogance will always crumble in the face of truth. Power, without wisdom, is fragile. But brilliance, true brilliance, shines beyond time, beyond ideology, beyond generations. Jasmine Crockett embodied that truth. Justice Breyer, with a single gesture of acknowledgement, affirmed it, and that is why. This moment matters. It wasn't just a debate. It was a mirror showing us what justice looks like when it's not about dominance, but about respect. What America looks like when voices of resilience and wisdom meet in the same room, cross different generations, and recognize each other. Her brilliance froze. The court and history will remember it, but now the story doesn't end here. It begins with you. If you believe voices like Jasmine Crockett's must be heard loud, unapologetic, and unstoppable, then don't just watch. Subscribe, share, keep this conversation alive. Because moments like this don't just belong to a headline, they belong to a movement. Together, we write what comes next.